Thanks for joining us today to discuss life and godliness with Rick and Angela Carter. If you'd like to be part of the conversation, email us at carters4hope@gmail.com. That's Carters, the number 4, hope@gmail.com. Any questions you have, we'll discuss in future episodes. Right now, sit back and let's join in on the conversation. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We had a little weird stuff going on here a minute ago trying to figure out getting everything rolling this morning. We are actually still in Tonasket. This is our last day in Tonasket, actually. Yep. But next week, we're going to be traveling and not able to record podcast during the week. So this is what you're listening to is kind of a earlier recorded or
we will have a crazy week of travel.
Yeah, we travel over to Oshkosh.
Overnight.
We have to fly from Seattle. We leave Seattle at like midnight and fly to Oshkosh. And that was the only flights we could get were from midnight on. And so anyway, praise the Lord.
Yes, and then flying back, so then we couldn't record. So.
Right, so we don't fly back until Friday.
And obviously we can't take our equipment with us. So.
Right, so anyway, but we are excited to be able to have a little time here to do another podcast today anyway. So today we are going to talk about differences in ministries, kind of, but mostly comparing ministries. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of times people in ministry struggle with is seeing the hardships of their own ministry and then not seeing the hardships of other people's ministries. In other words, thinking the grass is
greener.
That's going to say, the grass is always greener over the septic tank, right? So we always see how hard our ministry is. And when we see other people, we're like, well, look, they've got, things are going perfect for them. They don't really have any troubles. They have this many people, or they have this much support, or they're in this place and that place must be perfect compared to my place. And I was thinking about that this week. We're in Tonasket here, Washington. It's a small town. Groceries are expensive.
Oh, man. I was thinking about this morning when we were walking through the grocery store this morning because we needed oat milk and sausage. And I was thinking about just the prices of things are very comparable to European prices.
We bought the only thing of oat milk they had. We used that to make oatmeal with. It's really good, by the way. And then we bought one small package of sausage, and we bought a bottle of chocolate milk.
Yeah. And the bottle of chocolate milk was it was half a gallon. It was $5.
Yeah, it was $16 for those 3 items. So...
But I was walking through looking at the cheese and looking at all that kind of stuff, like we always do when we go to different places. And I was thinking, these prices remind me so much of the prices that were in Europe. Yeah. And it's been several years since we've been in Europe, so I'm sure the prices in Europe have gone up even more. But I was just like, it was crazy. Yeah. So, but, you go around a small town. Small town's different than Oklahoma City, where we were pastoring. Just the people are friendly. A blessing, they're a lot of times more personable, to talk to in a small town. Although, on the other hand, they do know everybody's business.
They want to know everyone's business, and that's why they talk to everybody, And we both grew up in small towns, and Angela's family was third generation. Angela was third generation in the town she grew up in, and she was still not considered They were not considered like in the in group of the town, in a town of like under 2,000 people.
Yeah. I mean, we weren't, I would say we were like middle. We weren't considered the upper echelon of the town.
Well, certainly.
But we weren't considered the lower either. We were kind of in that middle no man's land.
Yeah, but it was more like, they're in town.
Yeah, they live here.
But they're not like one of the...
influential people.
Well, not just that, but not one of the founding families of the town is what I mean. Like, it's always like, well, they're still relatively newcomers, they're still like, they're not one of us who have been here for
now. I would say kind of probably now,
fourth generation is there.
They're considered part of the town. Like everybody knows them. Everybody, like, I think
This would be your sister's kids, though.
Yeah, but I think mostly because of my dad in his latter years became kind of the community handyman. And so then they viewed him as part of the community.
Okay. But when we got married, that really wasn't the case at all. No. So, and we've been married 31 years now. So it's just that way. It's like it takes a long time to break into a small town and become part of the community. I grew up with, my dad was starting churches, and we were always the newcomers, because we would move into a town. We've been there for just a few years. Yeah. But it is an interesting dynamic for smaller towns. But then you get into a larger town and nobody knows you. And nobody even cares whether you're there or not. It's like, there's a lot more people and people are busier. That is one big thing about a bigger town. It's very much busier. And so the ministries are busier generally as well. But
it takes longer to get to know them.
That's differences in towns, and there's differences in countries. Even regions of the United States, people think of the United States as a monolithic thing, but culturally, people in the Northwest up here are more like Europeans than they are like Oklahomans.
Right.
And I would say if you break the U.S. apart into regions, sometimes people would think, well, Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and then West, and then maybe far West, like the coastal region. But there's way more regions than that.
You have regions within states.
Within states even, yeah, certainly. And so where people just don't think, that people think differently in different places. And, it's similar in some ways to Europe, where country to country you're going to have distinctions. Maybe they're all Europeans, but they don't. Even then, they don't think the same. They have different, cultural habits, and that's the same in the U.S. So, but mindset-wise, what we found when we moved from Oregon to Oklahoma, and then we went on a trip over to England to visit one of our missionaries, the Gossmeyers, and we felt more comfortable at that time in in England than in Oklahoma.
Yes,
because it was more like where we had been there in.
We had culture shock when we moved from Oregon back to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
It was different. And I didn't feel like I really necessarily had culture shock moving from Oklahoma to Oregon.
Well, I think part of that was, though, when we moved, we had been traveling in the Northwest for a year and a half doing evangelism. And
so
then
we had been up here.
So we had
it was very dramatic moving back.
Yes.
Very dramatic.
It was very dramatic.
Yeah.
So, but, one of the things that I think both of us have heard from numerous different places, not necessarily since we've been traveling, but just over the year, is people who are like, well, church planters maybe, who say, well, easy for that pastor who's full-time to talk about living by faith because he gets a full-time salary, and man, what would it be like to have be full-time at the church and not have to work a job? Or people in various other ministries who maybe look at a pastor or look at a missionary or a church planter, people that are in, say, addiction ministries or various different things like that, where they invest a lot of time and maybe they are even full-time at it, but yet financially struggling to be in that ministry, or a prison ministry, or those type of things, where, they look at some other ministries and they go, well, it must be nice to have those benefits of that ministry because my ministry is much harder than that. But it's a perception, and it's not a true perception, because every ministry, every community, every country has its own challenges. Even being here in the United States, sometimes missionaries can get the idea, well, pastors have it made because they're in the U.S. and they don't have to learn a different language, or they don't have to deal with the different culture stuff. But the reality is, there's challenges to being a pastor that you don't have on the mission field. And I can't speak as someone who's been on the mission field. I can speak as someone who started a church, someone who's pastored a larger church, and someone who's been in evangelism. But I can tell you this, I have a very close pastor friend who was a foreign missionary for over a decade, who now pastors here in the States, who has told me numerous times, if the Lord would let me go back to the mission field, I'd go in a heartbeat. He said to me, when I was on the mission field, I thought, man, pastors have it so easy. And now that I'm pastoring, I realize I had it so much easier. And I'm not saying every missionary has it easier than pastors. That was his experience. But it pointed out to me, by his testimony, it's always just, well, it's easier over there, or it's easy over here. And it's not. It's where God puts us. He has equipped us for that challenge. Yes. And that is a important thing to understand. It might look a little shaky right here because
I didn't think about it.
Angela started we have a washer and dryer, but when that dryer, or when the washer spins, it shakes the trailer. So
I didn't notice it move too much. I noticed us moving.
But whenever we deal with things like that, Angela's going to get the giggles now. So there we are. we're dealing with those type of things, as far as our ministry, I think Paul says it best when he says, comparing themselves among themselves, they're not wise. It's not good to try and compare our ministry to someone else's ministry, because we're always going to see the rosier side of their ministry. And most people aren't out talking about all the struggles they have. Some people are. Some people really want everyone to know what struggles they have,
or perceived struggles.
And that's not a good. Not a good thing at all, by the way.
No, and it's like social media. Nobody puts forth their bad face on social media. Most
people don't. Most people don't.
Good face, and it's the same with ministries. We only present the good part of the ministry. We don't present the stand up late at night crying and the heartache, the attacks, the whatever.
Right.
So.
And, when we started our first church in 1994, we were way young. And we had our first church split, I think, 6 months into it.
Yeah.
Something like that. We went from 28 to 2 over music.
Mm-hmm. You don't hear that very often anymore.
28 to 2. And started over. And, matter of fact, we have not pastored a church where we didn't have a church split. Not a single time. Well, that's not true. We started the church there in Stratford, and turned it over before anything like that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't live there. We started it at a distance, and I would fly there and work through that and so forth. So, of the churches where we've lived and pastored, we've not had any that we didn't have a split. Starting a church, there's some challenges to starting a church. Finding a place to live, becoming familiar in the community. How do I reach this community? How do I
learning the community culture?
Yeah, how do I approach them? Because every community is a little different. And, setting up the finances, working a job while you do that, and trying to balance work and home and church, and, while you're trying to start, and, all of those, there's a lot of challenges there. Not having funds to buy materials for Sunday school and, different things like that, designing tracks. And thankfully, God gave us some gifting in that area of the curriculum side of it. So we tended to write our own curriculum, but that's not a lot of times that's not the case, and so there's complications with all of those things. I remember when we were in our first church, God provided us a building pretty quickly. In our second church plant, we never got into a building. We were only, to the time we left, we were just renting a facility.
We rented a garage, an old mechanic garage.
Well, it wasn't a mechanic garage. It was the shop next to
it smelled like the mechanic garage.
There was a garage next door to it, but it was the offices of what had been a garage.
And then we rented downtown, storefront downtown.
Not there.
I thought they moved downtown.
Well, they did. We didn't. We were in that same location. We were a great location, and it wasn't over expensive, and we were doing well there when we turned it over. That was when we went to Bible college. And then we did evangelism. Served on staff at Beth Haven.
Which has a whole nother set of challenges.
Did evangelism for a year and a half, and then started the church in the Dalles, and we started in a Seventh-day Adventist building. And then God gave us a facility there, and we had a nice facility we turned over there. And then went to Beth Haven. So one of the things I thought when we moved back to Beth Haven, I think probably the biggest transitional change was going from church planting to pastoring a church of, we were running right at 40, just over 40 when we left the Dalles, Oregon, and we were working part-time. The church was paying us part-time. We were working part-time. And I thought, when I get to Beth Haven, I'm not going to be working a secular job. What am I going to do with all my extra time? That's actually a stupid thing that I said to my wife. Statement. What do I do with my extra time?
What time?
Then we moved. At the time, Beth Haven was running about 130, and we quickly started growing. But we had a lot of seniors in the church that we were in the hospital all the time. All the time. We were in the hospitals and various different places and visiting folks. And I went from what I thought was busy working a job and pastoring to insanity in reality in a very short space of time.
Because we're still trying to figure out, our kids were young teens, just preteen and young teen, and trying to figure out family life, both of us working, where before that hadn't been the case.
Right.
School and...
Right. Well, both of us working at Beth Haven. Angela was the secretary at first because the former pastor's wife had been the secretary, and just certain situations there. But anyway, it was just it was such a big change in our lifestyle. And also going from a smaller town, not small, but the town there I think was a total of maybe 17,000 people, which was that's a decent sized town, I think. But then we went to Oklahoma City, which is a metropolitan area. And if you're not from, if you're from a New York or Houston, you might not think of Oklahoma City as a metropolitan, but
it is.
It is. I mean, the population
Compared to
there
here.
is around 1.5 million with the suburbs and stuff like that, maybe a little more than that. So it's a large area and, just a different environment completely. So I know pastorally, I spent the same amount of time actually studying for messages from each of those ministries, and even now, studying and preparing messages and praying on, what to preach and all that type of stuff. Obviously, in a larger ministry, we spend a lot more time on member visitation type stuff, as far as visiting in the hospitals and all that. We did very little of that in our church planting. I mean, only a couple hospital visits that I even recall. Just when you have fewer people, you have fewer hospital issues. And when you have an older congregation, you have more. And then the more people you have, the more of that you're going to have. I think pastorally, it was maybe the busyness, the planning, the budgeting on a different scale. Whereas in evangelism, all we have to worry about is our own finances, really. When you're pastoring, you have the church finances. If you're starting a church, concern with budget is often, is there enough to pay the rent and that type of stuff? And how do I move from from a small to having a salary in the church and those type of thoughts?
And then just also not just the general budget, but then you have trying to teach them the missions, and you have missions budget. And then if you don't have a building, then you have a building fund budget, and then trying to manage all of those and build all of those at the same time.
Yeah, and that's just different in a small church plant environment or a small church versus a larger church. And we didn't pastor a large church. We pastored a church of a couple hundred, and not a couple hundreds and hundreds, but a couple hundred. And yet the financial stuff was so dramatically different.
Right.
And sending missionaries and
that adds
all the
a
different
whole
ministries. And
other layer, because then not only are you concerned about just the church finances, but then now you're concerned about your missionary. And do they have enough finances coming in? Making sure their health and wellness and mental health and all of that plays a part in their communicating with them.
It is different pastoring, and maybe some people, maybe someone who's sent out of a church doesn't understand this, and maybe not all pastors are the same. I do understand that there's some pastors.
Weird.
There's some pastors that basically just ignore their sent missionaries. We were not like that.
Because our missionaries were our friends too.
And
we heard about them.
I really would encourage you, if you have people sent out of your church, to remember that they are members of the church, and they need that pastoral care as well. They're in ministry, but they still need pastoral care. They still need that encouragement and watchfulness as a pastor. So there was certainly a lot more stress in that environment. I didn't realize how much more at first, and over time I think that kind of started to catch up to me a bit, but there certainly was a lot more stress in that environment. I remember telling Angela at times when we were pastoring, not that I'm going to quit or I'm with it, but I remember saying, boy, wouldn't it be nice to start to be pastoring a small church again, where all we had to do is just the smaller, be less busy and have, wouldn't it be perfect if we were in a church where we were able to be full-time but not have many people? Say, well, I thought you were talking about not doing that. I am talking about not doing that, but I'm normal too. And we have those thoughts where it's like, boy, this would be perfect or that would be perfect. I will tell you what I didn't want to do was what I'm doing. I don't like traveling, and yet I feel like this is what God wants us to do. I want to be in God's will, regardless of what that is, but traveling's not my... I don't enjoy traveling. Angela does. Angela loves to travel. But so God evidently answers her prayers more than he answers mine. But either way, the thing is that there's just a lot of differences pastorally speaking. Talk about pastor's wife. What's the difference ministry-wise between a pastor's wife in a smaller setting versus a larger church like Beth Haven? There it goes again. It's not an earthquake.
It's fixing to be done. I think probably pastor's wife in a small church it had its own challenges because there's just a couple of ladies usually, not many. And so then you're trying to, I think you develop bonds that are stronger because there are just a few of you. But then at the same time, then when trouble arises, that causes greater hurt because the bonds are stronger. It has its challenges. In a small town, there's not as much to do. I personally don't know that I could go back to a small town.
Well, if that's what God told us to do.
Yeah, if that's what God told us to do. But I struggle after living in the city environment. Coming back to a small town, I struggle.
People in small towns don't understand that.
No.
I didn't understand that when I was from a small town. I didn't like the idea of a city. And I thought, why is it that people... Because in starting churches, my dad started churches, we would have people say, well... We couldn't come out to that town because the Walmart's an hour away or something like that. And we were like, what in the world does that have to do with anything? And to be honest, it ought not be the deciding factor in the Lord's will. It should not be. No. But at the same time, the convenience of having things close by.
Yeah, the struggle.
It certainly is more understandable to Angela now. Not to me, because she orders most stuff off Amazon anyway.
But that wasn't the case when we were first starting churches.
But it is now?
It is now, but it wasn't the case then. So yeah, and especially if you had like little kids. I'm thinking about, when we were in, these are vibrating. No, it's the blinds. Anyway, this is going to be a fun episode for
Angela is now instructed to never start the washer when we're going to record.
Yeah, sorry.
Hereby deemed decreed. All right, good.
You just get to experience life on the road with Rick and Angela. But it is a struggle because then you have to pack the kids up, drive, 30 minutes or 40 minutes, whatever, go do your shopping. It's an all-day event instead of just a quick 30-minute trip or whatever. So I do get the convenience side of all of that.
And there are more options of things to do with your family if you're living in a...
That is true, too.
In a city,
Yeah, so I do get that. But like you said, it shouldn't be the deciding factor. If it's God's will, He'll give you the grace to go through it. And you'll adapt and overcome and all of that kind of stuff. Ministry-wise, from the ladies' point of view, in a bigger church, there's obviously a lot more to do. You have more ministries, you have more things you can do, more events you can go to, more whatever that you can do. And so, I wish I'd have known more. I wish I'd have known the things I know now. I wish I'd have known when we first started the three churches, the two in Kansas.
I think everybody would feel that way. They wish they knew then what they know.
In Oregon, but I think I would have felt more fulfilled if I'd have known a little bit more. I think because I didn't know as much, I struggled more trying to figure it out, and, experience, you learn those things. So
right. And I think it's good for people maybe to hear that there are times when other people don't necessarily feel very fulfilled in ministry.
Yeah.
Because I think that's an experience most people have, but very few talk about, to be honest.
Because I felt like I just, in the first two for sure, because I knew nothing about ministry. I just felt like I was kind of being drug along and I didn't know what I was doing. So I just was like I kind of felt like a blind person trying to feel their way through a room, because I had no idea what I was doing and I didn't know what I was actually looking for, or, searching for, or what to do. So it just was a complete, I don't even know what the right word is. It was just, I just didn't know. I just didn't understand.
Yeah, my experience was quite different than that because I grew up in church planting and I had seen it done 8 times. And so when we started into ministry, I knew, kind of the process and what to do. And that doesn't mean it was easy. It was just, I had a sense of what I was going to do. And Angela didn't grow up in ministry at all and really only started faithfully in church as a teenager for about 3 years before we met.
3 years.
So she hadn't even seen the ladies' side of ministry. I don't know if...
No, I don't remember.
Did Mrs. Rowe do much with ladies? Was it only with the adult ladies, or...?
I don't know, because as a teenager, we did youth activities. We would go to youth rallies and things like that, but I don't ever remember attending a Bible study. I don't, anything like that. I don't remember like a mother-daughter dinner, lunch, tea, whatever. I don't remember any of that.
Yeah.
And maybe we did, and I just have a dumb memory and I don't remember, but
I think it's called a bad memory, not a dumb
Whatever.
memory.
Whatever. It's dumb. It should remember. Anyway.
Yeah.
But
Now-
I don't remember any of it. So it's like, so I didn't know to do any of that. I didn't know that I could have Bible studies. I didn't know to do ladies' luncheons. I didn't know to
Well, and it's not just you didn't know to do it, but you didn't know how. Even when you started doing it, you were very insecure about doing those different things because you hadn't been involved in them.
Sure.
And so we would sit and talk a lot about.
I didn't do
you know,
any of those things until we were at Beth Haven. Even after going to Beth Haven to school and being on staff and being involved in baby showers and
but there
all
was
of those things.
Yeah, there weren't a lot of ladies ministry. There weren't like ladies Bible studies when we went to school.
No, there was showers and
Mother's Day, we didn't have. You didn't have like a Mother's
But we
Day
did a
mother-daughter banquet. You
general-
had we had
a church-wide.
church Sunday night church dinner on Mother's Day.
Yes.
Or lunch.
Yeah, so I didn't know any of those things. And so I think in Oregon, when we were in Oregon, I didn't do any of that either. I didn't do...
Right.
And I was dealing with children in school.
And children change ministry dramatically
Yeah.
based on their age.
Yes.
When you're a young family, there's so much more time involved in just
Schooling.
caring for your children,
Yeah.
watching your children when they're, 2 and 3 and 4, where, you have to make sure they're not running wild and tearing stuff up.
Yeah.
And then as they get into elementary age, you got to, the educational side of it takes a lot more investment, their education. To me, one of the hardest times for ministry was when they were teenagers, not because they were bad teenagers.
We had great teenagers.
We had great kids, and we still have great kids, but we had a great relationship with them. But
We have one boy that thinks he's a little retarded right now. Shout out to Joshua. Sorry.
she's
I'm
just picking on
ribbing him.
She's just picking on him.
I'm picking on him.
But anyway, she when they were teenagers, though, the problem was not so much them; it was the expectations of people around us in the church that were being put on them. Well, if they said something goofy, well, you're supposed to be, you're the pastor's kid. You're supposed to set an example.
They do the same thing when they were little. It was just in a different way. Like
It became more intense.
Yeah, they shouldn't run around the church. They shouldn't do this. They shouldn't do that.
And they shouldn't.
Right.
They shouldn't be unkept. They
Right.
should be disciplined, and they were for the
The
most part.
same
But,
expectation was there. It just grew as they got older.
right. So I think it got worse when they were teenagers, personally, and then ministry after having teens. Of course, our kids were still in the church, but I thought ministry came a lot easier once they were their own families. In many ways, we did something kind of different, even when they were teens,
Because of this.
because we had a problem with someone attacking our kids. There's a tendency as a parent just to come to your kid's defense, and you want to do that. At the same time, you have to be mindful that sometimes your kids might not be in the right, and you've got to give an honest observation to that. And so what we did,
Because people can go to two extremes. Either they only defend their kids all the time, or they only
or they
take
never defend their kids. Yeah.
somebody else's side and never defend their kids.
So pastorally, what we did is I took that off of us, and I asked 2 men in the church, 2 of our deacons,
Spiritual men. We made sure they were spiritual.
men that were spiritual, that are spiritual. I said, if someone brings an accusation against a member of my family, I'm going to turn the oversight of that to you 2 men. I want you to sit down with my family member. I want you to sit down with the other person, and whatever you decide is the right way for proceeding, we'll agree to that. And I'll submit myself, and Angela too will submit to that.
Boy, that's hard.
It's difficult. That happened
We had 2
twice. And one time the decision was, your child is at fault here, and this is what they need to do. And I said, okay. And Mama was like, no, they're my kid. But it was
Time proved that Mama was right.
no, Mama wasn't right. Mama wasn't right.
It was good for my child, yes, but
It was good for
Mama was right about the person.
Mama was wrong. Mama was wrong about the circumstance. And she's still wrong about the circumstance, but she still feels emotional. That's how mamas are. But that's why I took that away from us. That's why I put that under other
was
men
good.
who would not be emotional about it, and men would make us a weighted decision on the facts. And it helped our child.
It did help our child.
And-
And it did help me too it helped me to see that while I didn't agree with the decision the men made,
As a mom.
it did help me to see that they were seeking the Lord and that they did desire the best for all parties involved, but it wasn't that I wanted them to be biased towards my child either. No, I didn't. Anyway, but it did help me to see that, I could trust the Lord, I could trust my kids, I could trust,
but you didn't say that to those men. You said it to me.
I said it to you, which is how I was. That's the proper channel, right? To go through. Like I said it to you, and then you let me vent, and then you were like, "Okay, now we're done. You said your piece.
Right.
This is what we're going to do." And I was fine.
Yeah.
And our child was fine. He didn't like it, but he had to learn to submit to authority as well.
Right. And it wasn't just me saying. It wasn't me taking someone else's side. It wasn't, or me taking their side, his side. It was him understanding spiritual authority in his life.
Yes.
And learning to accept the judgment of spiritual authority. And I think that's an important lesson. And I think that what we did there was a really big beneficial thing. And this is kind of off topic of what we were actually talking about. But I think it was beneficial because it helped our kids to not evaluate us as always taking their side or never taking their side. It really did. I think it helped a lot in there.
Well, like tying this into the topic we're talking about, sometimes in a smaller church you don't have that. You don't have those.
That's true.
Times where your kids can learn these.
Well, you might not have someone in the church that can do that. But here's where I would, if I were in a small church today, here's what I would do.
Or on the mission field.
I would ask a nearby pastor who was a spiritual man who I could trust, that if my kids are involved in some kind of a conflict with someone in the church, would they be the one to come over and hear both sides and give a judgment on that? So that I think it gives your kids a level of protection, also gives your church member a level of protection that says, it's not, the pastor's not just taking his kid's side. This is someone that's listened to both sides of this and has given a judgment. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's helpful, and it prevents this mentality of, what we said, the pastor's always taking his family side or the pastor never takes his kid's side. I think that's a necessary thing.
Yeah, because then I know it creates this atmosphere within the church where the people don't feel like they can bring anything to you because you're only going to take your kid's side.
Right.
Or, you're only going to see it one way. You're never going to see it another way. So, yeah, I think, and I know for a fact that there were many times people would come to us, hey, we're having this issue with your child. Even as an adult child, in the church, they would come to us and they knew.
You say many times. It happened a couple times.
A few.
It wasn't many.
You know what I mean. Where they didn't feel like
they don't know what you mean.
Well, whatever. They knew that they could come to us and that we would take an objective look at it because we had set this policy up in place. And so then they weren't afraid to come to us. And then also that helped strengthen the bond between us and the church members as well, because then they knew that we wanted the best for the entire situation, not just for, it wasn't just one-sided. So.
Yeah. So anyway, the whole point of this discussion today was really to talk about the differences of different ministries and accepting that your ministry is different than other people's ministries. Your ministry is not harder than everyone else's ministry, even though you know how hard your ministry is. It's not harder than everyone else's.
It's just
different. And if you were in someone else's ministry, you'd have challenges there too. And maybe the challenges there you would feel were heavier than the ones you have. And I will tell you this for sure, if you were in a ministry where it wasn't God's will for you to be there, the challenges would be way too big.
Yeah.
Way too heavy. So it's better to be in the ministry God wants you in and accept the challenges as just part of ministry. We've never been in a ministry where there weren't challenges. The ministry we have now, there's challenges, and they are what they are. Honestly, at first, it felt like they were a lot less.
Honeymoon stage.
And I don't feel like they're super heavy in the same sense, having experienced other ministries. But there's certainly challenges. It's not no challenges. It's just different challenges. And
to the outside, they may look, or to another ministry, they may look like less, but that's not always the case.
Yeah. I mean, some of the challenges we've faced recently, when you're traveling full-time, medical stuff becomes difficult.
Yeah.
I got to go find a barber today. I have a different barber every time I get a haircut now, and Angela has a different beautician. So it's not like you have that consistency of they know how to cut your hair. You have to re-explain it, and hope that they understand it.
I probably am not getting a haircut till I go back in July.
Well, you can do that. I can't. I mean...
Yeah, but then I just end up throwing it up like this, and it looks terrible.
Challenges of traveling all the time. There's always
stress.
stuff we're
The
fixing,
cost, my
fences, different.
Diesel out this way is ridiculous.
Preach it in a different church every week is different, and trying to be sensitive to what the Lord wants in a place where you're not familiar with who they are or what they need.
Not having those consistent emotional and social connections, because you're at a new place all the time.
It's challenges. There's challenges. They're not overwhelming challenges, but they're challenges. And by the way, they might be overwhelming for some people, if that's not what God called them to do. But my point is there's no ministry without challenges. And you always get a glassy view or a shiny view of other people's ministries, and you don't really know the weight that they're carrying. Sometimes we view too negatively the ministry we're in because we only look at the negatives. In such case, it'd be good to spend some time, maybe every day, write down 3 things you can be thankful for, something in the morning, noon, and night. You can be thankful for about the ministry God's given you, the life God's given you, the place, the people, whatever it is. And develop an attitude of gratitude toward seeing the good in what God's doing in your ministry as opposed to only seeing the bad.
Yeah.
And that would help you.
I was thinking about that this week because we're in a small town. There isn't anything to do. And
she struggled with that this week.
When we were in Coeur d'Alene, they had hikes right there that you could go to. There's nowhere. You have to drive.
30 minutes.
Yeah, 20 miles.
She keeps doing this. She's always putting her.
20 miles to get to a hike. And so... we don't want to drive. We drive all the time.
So we walk downtown, but...
That took a whole, half hour?
Yeah, 45 minutes.
So, anyway, so I struggled with that, but really bad yesterday, particularly. And then I was thinking about it last night that, probably the reason I struggled so bad is because that's all I thought about was the negative about it all day long instead of fixing my thinking. We teach that, fix your thinking, and it fixes your focus. You
don't always just do what I teach. You heard it.
I'm teasing.
You heard it.
I do. I think about it. That's why I thought about it last night. Why do I have such a bad attitude?
What was it I preached on last night?
Shush.
Anyway.
This is true confessions of
anyway, but you know what? We have enjoyed being here this week. We've enjoyed the church.
The church has been, for me, it's like pulling on my heartstrings because they have there was 50 people here without a pastor. Showed up so happy, wanting to serve the Lord and wanting to worship and wanting to, they still have ladies. They have ladies get-togethers. They have men get-togethers. They still have once-a-month fellowships. All of those things, all without a pastor. And they've been so faithful to the services.
They've been without a pastor for 2 months.
Yeah, but still.
But I will tell you, I know it's going to be, and this is what kind of stirred my thoughts on this topic today. It's going to be difficult for them to find a pastor, not because of the church, but because
it's a small town.
It's a small town. The nearest Walmart's 30 miles away, and anyway.
But it's just sad. It's sad in one respect because there's not a man. And then, so we're talking, do we even know anybody looking for a church? And we don't know anybody looking for a church. And this isn't the first church we've come across without a pastor. And so it's just sad that there's not men filling these pulpits and leading people that want a church and want to worship. One family drives an hour and 15 minutes or something like that to church one way. They live up the mountain,
And they've been faithful. To every service.
And so it's I don't know, it's just, so on one respect, I've thoroughly enjoyed being at the church. I've enjoyed, ministering with them, alongside them. But on the other side, it's just pulling at your heartstrings. And no, I know this is the ministry God has us in. I don't have any inkling that God is ordering us to step in and fill the pulpit. But it's just it's just sad. I get a little sad every time I go.
She gets emotional. We're going to hang up so she can have a good cry now. She's not going to do that. But we've talked about this week, and just the reality is there's not a lot of, sometimes because of small towns and different cultures and stuff like that. And I'm not saying anyone's wrong for thinking they belong in a certain area of the country. But
Don't get me wrong, I'm not a small town girl.
not anymore. But if you do know somebody, we know of a number of churches that are needing pastors. If you know somebody that's looking, that has a heart to pastor people and not just control people.
Right. I mean,
has a heart to come minister to people and not just rule over people.
Yeah.
And there's unfortunately
they would have to work a job here. There's not a salary or anything like that. But.
well, I don't know what the salary would be if there is any or not, but I do know this: it's a small town, and it just takes time in a small town. But anyway, we hope you're blessed. We hope you have a wonderful week this week, and we'll be back the next time we record. We will have been to Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
And then we'll be in Oak Harbor.
Yeah, so we'll talk to you then.
The bipolar show.
You were? Wow.
I don't know why. Very emotional today.
I guess.
I don't know why. To do this, I just keep blocking all of the scam likelies. I have to pick a new number every time they call me.